The trouble with answering a question like this is that most of what we call history was recorded by people who had a stake in a particular outcome. Those who conquered wrote the accounts of the conquered. Those who held people in bondage wrote the accounts of the enslaved. And colonial officials wrote the accounts of the populations they ruled over. None of this makes those records useless. But it does mean that when discussing Black life across the centuries, we're relying in part on a record built by people whose interests were often served by leaving the truth incomplete, simplified, or absent altogether. Recognizing that bias is the essential first step before going any further. The fuller picture, assembled from archaeology, oral tradition, source material generated within these communities themselves, and fast-developing modern scholarship, turns out to be far more expansive, longer, more painful, more triumphant, and more worth learning than whatever gets squeezed into a single unit of school curriculum wedged between Thanksgiving and the winter holidays. So let's begin at the true starting point, rather than jumping into the middle of the narrative. Africa is the continent where anatomically modern humans first appeared. Every person alive today, whatever they look like or wherever they live, can trace their lineage back to that continent. This is enormously significant for what follows, because it means Black history isn't some later addition to the broader human story. It's the very beginning of it. Every civilization that has ever existed anywhere on the planet descends, in a fundamental way, from populations that originated there. This isn't meant as an uplifting talking point. It's simply the established scientific position, backed by genetic research, paleoanthropology, and archaeological evidence. Over most of the last 100,000 years, African societies took on an almost dizzying variety of forms. Hunter-gatherer groups, such as the San people of southern Africa, kept alive one of the longest, continuously documented lifestyles anywhere on Earth, finely tuned to their particular surroundings, with deep bodies of knowledge, spiritual practices, and social organization built up across tens of thousands of years. Farming communities across the Sahel and the Great Lakes region built intricate systems for managing land, growing crops, and raising livestock, all well before any outside contact occurred. And starting around 3,000 years ago, a series of large, powerful, and advanced states began to rise across the continent. States whose sheer scale and achievement genuinely stunned European travelers when they eventually arrived, and which continue to be badly underrepresented in world history education today. Let's turn specifically to these empires, since this is where the historical record is most solid, and the gap between actual events and what students are taught is most obvious. The Kingdom of Kush, based in what is now Sudan, became strong enough to conquer Egypt itself, giving the ancient world a line of pharaohs of Nubian descent whose monuments remain standing to this day. The Aksumite Kingdom, located in present-day Ethiopia, rose to become one of the four dominant powers of the ancient world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. It controlled trade routes across the Red Sea that linked Africa, Arabia, India, and the Mediterranean world, produced its own currency, and made Christianity its official state religion in the 4th century, well ahead of most of Europe. Great Zimbabwe, a city built from stone with enormous walls fitted together without any mortar, was constructed roughly between the 11th and 15th centuries by the ancestors of today's Shona people, and served as the hub of a trading network that reached across southern Africa all the way to the coastline. The medieval empires of West Africa also merit close attention. Across roughly 1,000 years, the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai took turns controlling the trans-Saharan trade in gold and salt, generating enough wealth to place their rulers among the most influential political leaders anywhere in the world at the time. Mali's ruler, Mansa Musa, made his renowned pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, traveling with an entourage recorded as numbering in the tens of thousands and carrying so much gold that his journey reportedly drove down gold prices across the Mediterranean region for more than 10 years afterward. Within this empire, the city of Timbuktu became one of the world's great hubs of Islamic scholarship, home to universities and libraries that held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts covering mathematics, astronomy, law, medicine, and religious study. Many of these manuscripts still exist today and continue to be studied and translated. All of this matters for a straightforward reason. when the transatlantic slave trade began to accelerate in the 15th century, the people it targeted were not living in primitive societies, culturally or politically. They belonged to advanced civilizations with their own governmental systems, religious traditions, artistic accomplishments, and intellectual output. The slave trade's violence was not any kind of rescue or introduction to civilization for the people caught up in it. It was the deliberate destruction, on a scale that's difficult to fully grasp, of societies that had been developing over thousands of years. The scale of the transatlantic trade itself is hard to fully comprehend. Somewhere between 10 and 12 million Africans survived the ocean voyage and arrived in the Americas. An additional, unknown but sizable number died during their initial capture, on the forced marches to coastal ports, or aboard the slave ships during the crossing itself, often referred to as the Middle Passage. This forced displacement stretched across roughly 4 centuries, from the late 1400s to the mid-1800s, and constituted the largest forced relocation of human beings that had ever occurred up to that point in history. On the African side, the loss of communities, families, languages, and social networks left gaps that permanently altered the population makeup of entire regions. Meanwhile, the labor forced out of enslaved people in the Americas produced the agricultural wealth that helped drive industrial growth in both Europe and North America. In very direct and traceable ways, the economic base of the modern world was constructed on top of this system. One thing standard accounts consistently fail to emphasize is how enslaved people actually lived their day-to-day lives. There's more coverage of the legal and economic machinery of slavery than of the internal communities and social worlds that enslaved people built and sustained despite extreme violence and hardship. Throughout the Americas, enslaved people held onto, adjusted, and transformed pieces of African spiritual practice, music, language, family structure, and agricultural knowledge forms of culture that endured precisely because they were kept alive collectively and passed down intentionally from one generation to the next. The musical traditions that grew out of enslaved communities in the American South combined African rhythmic and tonal sensibilities with the distinct emotional language of an experience that had almost no historical precedent. These traditions eventually became the base vocabulary for nearly every major genre of American popular music throughout the 20th century: blues, jazz, gospel, soul, funk, rhythm and blues, and hip-hop, an almost unimaginably large cultural contribution from a community that was denied basic legal rights throughout the entire era in which this music was taking shape. Resistance against slavery was ongoing, took many forms, and was far more organized than most popular narratives suggest. Individual acts of sabotage, escape, and self-liberation occurred constantly. Larger, coordinated uprisings, including the Haitian Revolution of the 1790s, rocked slaveholding societies to their core. The Haitian Revolution deserves special mention as one of the most remarkable political events of the modern era. A colony of enslaved people defeated one of the most powerful armies on earth, that of Napoleon Bonaparte, and in 1804 established the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere. In response, slaveholding nations, including the United States, imposed decades of economic isolation and refused to formally recognize Haiti. France, meanwhile, forced Haiti to pay reparations equivalent to tens of billions of modern dollars to compensate for the lost labor of its formerly enslaved population. Payments Haiti kept making until 1947, which shaped the country's economic trajectory for well over 100 years. The formal end of slavery across the Americas began in the late 18th century and reached its conclusion in the United States in 1865. Ushering in a period marked by both remarkable political opportunity and an equally intense violent backlash. During Reconstruction, Black Americans in the United States voted, ran for, and held public office at every level, from local school boards to the U.S. Senate, and built institutions and communities that clearly demonstrated what genuine access to political rights could accomplish. This period didn't end because it failed. It ended because organized, sustained campaigns of white supremacist violence tore down black political power throughout the South and replaced it with a system of legal segregation and economic subjugation that lasted nearly 100 years. Upheld through terror and tolerated by both state and federal governments. The Jim Crow era that followed tends to be understood mainly through its legal and political effects, but its cultural and social dimensions matter just as much. Black Americans in the late 1800s and early 1900s built remarkable institutions under conditions specifically engineered to stop them from doing so. Historically, black colleges and universities trained generations of doctors, lawyers, teachers, scientists, and engineers at a time when nearly every predominantly white institution was closed to them, whether by law or in practice. Black-owned newspapers, such as the Chicago Defender, reached readers nationwide and helped shape political opinion. The Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s produced an intense burst of literary, artistic, and intellectual achievement work that wasn't just excellent on its own terms, but that deliberately and consciously took up the task of defining Black American identity in its own voice, rather than through the distorted portrayals found in mainstream white American culture. The intellectual tradition that runs through this period represents one of the most significant and most consistently overlooked bodies of thought in Western intellectual history. In the 1840s, Frederick Douglass was producing political philosophy of the highest caliber, engaging with constitutional interpretation and the logic underlying democratic legitimacy at a level that holds up entirely on its own, separate from the remarkable story of his own life. In the 1890s, Ida B. Wells conducted and published investigative journalism on lynching that paired rigorous factual reporting with moral clarity and real political courage, all while facing genuine physical danger. W.E.B. Du Bois' concept of double consciousness, introduced around the turn of the 20th century, remains one of the most enduring and productive frameworks in American social thought. These were not minor or peripheral figures. They were among the sharpest political and social thinkers of their time, writing from a vantage point that gave them particular clarity about how power, law, and social structure actually functioned within American democracy. The 20th century brought sweeping change across both the African diaspora and the African continent itself. In the United States, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s is often portrayed simply as an appeal to America's conscience that succeeded once the country acknowledged its wrongdoing. The actual story is considerably more complicated and considerably more instructive. The movement was strategically sharp, tightly organized, and sustained over years by thousands of ordinary participants who endured violence, economic punishment, and personal danger in order to take part. Its legislative victories came from a combination of moral persuasion, economic pressure, political organizing, and deliberately confrontational tactics designed to expose the brutality of segregation to audiences at home and abroad, at a time when Cold War politics made America's racial practices a diplomatic problem. At the same time, decolonization was reshaping the political map of the entire African continent. A small handful of independent African nations in 1945 grew into dozens by 1970, as European empires, weakened by war and increasingly delegitimized by the new global emphasis on self-determination, released their colonial holdings, usually with great reluctance. The leaders of these independence movements, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, and Leopold Senghor in Senegal, produced political thought of genuine depth, grappling with the relationship between African cultural identity and the building of modern states, the economic realities of decolonization, and the possibilities for continental unity within a world divided by Cold War power blocs. South Africa's story runs along a similar path but extends further into the modern era. Apartheid, the system of strictly enforced racial segregation formally established in 1948, stood as one of the most thoroughly constructed systems of racial control in modern history, maintaining white minority rule for nearly 50 years through a combination of legal structure, economic control, and outright violence. The African National Congress, founded in 1912, kept up organized resistance across decades marked by bans, exile, and imprisonment. Nelson Mandela's release in 1990 after 27 years in prison, followed by his election in 1994 as South Africa's first democratically chosen president. stands as one of the most significant political transformations of the 20th century, occurring without the widespread violence that most observers had anticipated and that historical precedent suggested was nearly unavoidable. Black life today, on a global scale, exists fully within the weight of this history without being defined solely by it. African nations, each internally diverse, are managing the specific economic and political consequences of colonial extraction and Cold War meddling while still building their own institutions, economies, and cultural identities according to their own priorities. African American, Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Brazilian, and Black European communities are each internally varied as well, shaped by their own particular local histories and present circumstances, even as they share certain cultural inheritances and political experiences. The worldwide reach of African American cultural production in music, film, sports, and fashion represents one of the most remarkable examples of cultural influence in human history, all the more notable because it emerged from a community that spent most of its existence deliberately shut out of formal economic and political power. What gets lost whenever this history is condensed, oversimplified, or taught mainly through its worst moments is both the full humanity of the people who lived it and the genuine depth of what they built, sustained, and created during every era, even the most brutal ones. Enslaved people who kept cultural practices alive across generations weren't merely passive victims swept along by forces beyond their control. They were people actively choosing what to preserve, what to adapt, and how to maintain their dignity and community under circumstances specifically designed to make all of that as hard as possible. The intellectuals, organizers, artists, and political figures who appear throughout this history weren't rare exceptions rising out of an otherwise passive background. They were the visible face of an ongoing collective effort by communities that consistently produced extraordinary individuals generation after generation. It's also worth highlighting something that rarely gets enough attention: the long-standing presence of African and African-descended people in places outside the usual focal points of this story. There were Black communities in medieval Europe. Soldiers, scholars, diplomats, and merchants documented in Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, and British records. The Moors, largely North African and Sub-Saharan African Muslims, held a presence across the Iberian Peninsula for nearly 800 years, and their impact on Spanish, Portuguese, and by extension Latin American culture, architecture, music, and language is well documented and traceable. Significant African and African-descended communities also existed in medieval Persia, India, and across Southeast Asia, developing their own distinct local identities while still holding on to specific cultural inheritances from their origins. The spread of African-descended people across the globe predates the transatlantic slave trade by many centuries, occurring through the Islamic slave trade across North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, as well as through voluntary trade and migration. Recognizing this broader global presence significantly complicates any account of Black history that treats Africa and its diaspora as geographically isolated before European contact. There's also an important dimension tied specifically to the experience of Black women throughout this history, one that too often gets folded into broader accounts rather than examined on its own. Enslaved Black women faced the specific added danger of sexual exploitation on top of every other burden of enslavement, a reality that shaped family structures, community relationships, and political awareness in particular ways. To the women involved in the abolitionist movement were not secondary figures in a story dominated by men. Harriet Tubman made around 19 trips back into slave territory, guiding hundreds of people to freedom. Sojourner Truth navigated the intersecting issues of race and gender with powerful rhetorical skill. The mothers who kept cultural and spiritual traditions alive across generations of enslavement were themselves engaged in a form of deliberate, ongoing political resistance that standard historical accounts rarely describe in those terms. The women of the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, Diane Nash, Pauli Murray, frequently carried out the sustained organizational labor that kept the movement running, even as historical attention fell disproportionately on charismatic male leaders. Recovering the complete story of Black history means recovering the complete story of Black women's experience within it, which remains its own substantial and still developing area of historical work. It's also worth saying something directly about the role of the arts in this history, not as mere decoration or a way of coping, but as real political and intellectual labor. The development of the blues in the Mississippi Delta in the early 1900s, the creation of jazz in New Orleans, and later in the clubs of Chicago and New York, and the emergence of soul, funk, and hip-hop from specific communities in specific American cities were not simply aesthetic accomplishments happening in some neutral cultural space. These art forms were created by communities whose basic humanity was being legally and socially challenged by artists who were often denied copyright protection and fair economic compensation for their own work, even while that same work was being exploited commercially on a massive scale. The history of American popular music is, among other things, an ongoing pattern of Black cultural creation being taken, credited to others, and then reinvented once again by Black artists who developed new forms specifically because their earlier innovations had been appropriated. Understanding this history doesn't take anything away from the music itself. It adds a whole additional layer of meaning that was already embedded in the music, available to anyone who knows the history behind it. It's also worth bringing in something genuinely important about the specific role religion played throughout this history, since it runs through nearly every part of what's been discussed and rarely receives the attention it deserves. African religious traditions, which varied enormously across the continent, were actively suppressed during the transatlantic slave trade and the colonial period that followed, often as part of explicit programs of Christian conversion that portrayed African spirituality as fundamentally incompatible with being civilized. What actually took place, though, was far more complicated. Enslaved people in the Americas created blended spiritual traditions, Vodou in Haiti, Candomblé in Brazil, Santeria in Cuba, that fused African spiritual and cosmological frameworks with elements of Catholicism, preserving African theological content beneath a surface that appeared to be acceptable Christian practice. These weren't compromises or corruptions of either tradition. They were sophisticated theological innovations that functioned simultaneously as spiritual practice, cultural preservation, and coded resistance. And they've produced some of the richest and most intricate religious traditions found anywhere in the modern world. The particular version of Christianity developed by Black Americans is itself a distinct theological and liturgical tradition, shaped by the specific experience of being enslaved and excluded within a country that used Christian scripture to justify that very enslavement. The Black church, as an institution, was never simply a place of worship. It served as the central institution of community life, political organizing, education, and collective identity for Black Americans throughout the entire span, from emancipation through the civil rights era and beyond. The particular theology that developed within it, centered on liberation, dignity, and the idea that the moral universe bends over the long run toward justice, wasn't simply borrowed wholesale from white American Protestant tradition. It grew out of a specific history of suffering and resistance, and it gave the civil rights movement much of its moral vocabulary and organizational foundation. So, what was Black life actually like across history? It was ancient before it was anything else. It was powerful, prosperous, and intellectually rich before it was stripped of those things. It stayed resistant, creative, and organizationally sophisticated through periods when resistance demanded real courage. It produced intellectual traditions of the highest order, even while being systematically shut out of the institutions that were supposed to recognize and reward intellectual work. It built community institutions, artistic traditions, and political organizations under conditions specifically designed to prevent exactly that. And it continues today, across an enormous range of specific places, languages, and political situations, as one of the longest, most consequential, and most genuinely global stories found anywhere in the human record. The complete version of that story is still being pieced together and still being told, and by any reasonable standard, it ranks among the most important histories anyone could